My husband looked me straight in the eyes, set down his coffee cup with a calm, deliberate click against the granite counter, and said the words that would end my old life in an instant: "I don't need you anymore." 24 hours after signing the papers that made him the sole heir to his estranged father's $58 million fortune, the man I had loved for 11 years told me to pack a bag and be gone by morning. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracle of second chances even when the world seems determined to take everything from you, I want you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one remind all of us in our community that love, real love, is tested most severely not in poverty but in sudden, blinding wealth. My name is Marissa Calloway, and before that morning in early June, would have told you that Grant Calloway was the kindest man I had ever known. We met when we were both 26, working entry-level jobs at a mid-sized architecture firm in Columbus, Ohio, he in drafting, me in accounting. He used to bring me coffee before I even asked for it, remembering that I liked it with too much cream and barely any sugar, the opposite of how he took his. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony in his mother's backyard, string lights threaded through the maple trees, 40 guests, a borrowed dress from my cousin Wendy that fit almost perfectly. Grant's father, Harold Calloway, was not there. Harold had left the family when Grant was 14, chasing some business opportunity in Nevada, and over the following 2 decades he had sent exactly 3 birthday cards and 1 strained phone call on the day Grant graduated college. Grant rarely spoke of him, and when he did, his jaw would tighten in a way that told me the wound had never fully closed, only scarred over, thin and fragile. For 11 years, Grant and I built something ordinary and, I thought, beautiful. We were not wealthy. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a suburb called Whetstone Hollow, with a mortgage that kept us up some nights and a used Honda that Grant nursed along with duct tape optimism. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small chain of veterinary clinics, and Grant eventually became a project manager at a construction firm, the kind of job that paid decently but never let you forget the price of everything. We had 2 children, a daughter named Josephine who was 9 and had her father's stubborn chin, and a son named Theodore, 6, who still believed his mother could fix anything with a hug and a graham cracker. We were not a perfect family. We fought about money, about whose turn it was to handle the dishes, about the slow erosion of romance that happens to every marriage under the weight of bills and bedtimes. But underneath it all, I believed we were a team. I believed that when Grant looked at me across the dinner table, exhausted after a long day, there was still something there, some thread connecting us that had survived a decade of ordinary struggle. Then, in March, Grant received a phone call that changed everything. Harold Calloway had died of a sudden heart attack in a lakeside home in Michigan, alone except for a housekeeper who found him the next morning. Grant did not cry when he told me. He sat very still at our kitchen table, turning his phone over and over in his hands, and said only, "He's gone," in a voice that sounded more confused than grieving, as though he could not decide what emotion he was supposed to be having. I held him that night, and for weeks afterward, I watched him move through a strange, quiet grief for a father who had given him almost nothing except absence. I thought that was the hardest part behind us. I had no idea what was coming. It turned out that Harold Calloway, the father who abandoned his family and never once sent child support in 20 years, had spent the final decade of his life building a private equity firm that specialized in undervalued commercial real estate. He had, without ever telling a single member of his estranged family, become extraordinarily wealthy. When the will was read in early June, in a sterile conference room in a law office in downtown Columbus, Grant discovered that he was the sole beneficiary of an estate worth $58 million. I sat beside him in that conference room, holding his hand, watching the lawyer's mouth move through numbers that did not seem real, and I felt something strange settle in my stomach, not joy exactly, but a kind of vertigo, as though the ground beneath our marriage had just shifted in a way I could not yet name. For the first day after the will was finalized, Grant seemed almost like himself, dazed but grateful, talking about paying off the mortgage, maybe helping my sister with her medical bills, maybe finally taking the kids to Disney World like we had promised for 3 years running. I remember making him a cup of coffee that evening, the way I always did, and he thanked me the way he always did, and I let myself believe that money, even an obscene amount of it, would simply be a blessing layered on top of the life we had already built. I was wrong. I did not understand yet that money does not create character. It only reveals it, the way a receding tide reveals what has been hiding beneath calm water the whole time. The change began subtly, the way rot always begins subtly, in places you cannot see until the whole structure gives way. Grant started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. He mentioned, almost in passing, a woman named Diane Whitfield, a financial consultant Harold had apparently used for years, who had reached out to help Grant manage the transition. He began using phrases that did not sound like him, phrases about legacy and vision and not wanting to be weighed down by old patterns. I told myself he was overwhelmed, that any person would need time to adjust to a fortune landing on them out of a clear sky. I made him dinner. I kept the children quiet in the evenings so he could think. I did everything a devoted wife does when she senses her husband is struggling, because 11 years had taught me that Grant Calloway, beneath his occasional gruffness, was a fundamentally decent man who simply needed patience. Then came the morning that broke my life in half. It was a Tuesday, sunlit, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. Josephine and Theodore had already left for school on the bus, and I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring Grant his coffee out of habit, cream and barely any sugar, when he walked in wearing a shirt I did not recognize, expensive looking, the kind of soft blue cotton that costs more than our old grocery budget for a week. He did not sit down. He stood across the counter from me, and there was something different in his eyes, a coldness I had never seen directed at me in 11 years of marriage, not even during our worst fights. He told me that he had been thinking clearly for the first time in years, that he realized now how much he had settled, how the life we built together had been small, constrained, beneath what he now understood he deserved. And then he said it, the sentence that would replay in my mind for months afterward like a wound that would not close: "I don't need you anymore, Marissa. I think it's time you accepted that." I remember the coffee cup shaking slightly in my hand. I remember asking him, in a voice that did not sound like my own, whether he was joking, whether this was some kind of stress reaction, some grief-fueled breakdown that we could work through together the way we had worked through everything else. He told me, with a calm that frightened me more than shouting would have, that Diane had helped him see things clearly, that a man of his new financial standing needed a partner who matched his ambitions, not a bookkeeper from Whetstone Hollow who balanced spreadsheets for a veterinary clinic chain. He told me he wanted a divorce, that he had already spoken to a lawyer, that I should pack a bag and be prepared to discuss custody arrangements for the children in the coming weeks. He said all of this standing up, drinking the coffee I had made him, as though he were discussing a business restructuring rather than the demolition of an 11-year marriage and the family we had built with our own exhausted, loving hands. I want to pause here and ask you, if this story is stirring something in your chest right now, to leave a comment below about a moment in your own life when you had to find strength you did not know you had. Our community has grown because people share their real stories in the comments, and I read every single one, because somewhere in the middle of writing this down, I remembered that healing happens when we stop carrying our pain alone. I did not scream at Grant that morning, though some part of me wanted to. I did not throw the coffee cup, though my hands trembled with the urge. Instead, I set the cup down very carefully, the way you set down something breakable when you are trying to keep your composure from shattering along with it, and I asked him one question: did he understand what he was throwing away? He looked at me with something close to pity, the particular contempt of a man who believes he has outgrown his own history, and said that 11 years of my life had been an investment in a version of himself that no longer existed. Then he walked out to the garage, got into a car I did not recognize, sleek and black and clearly purchased in the last 48 hours, and drove away without looking back. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after he left. The sunlight moved slowly across the tile floor, the way it always did on ordinary Tuesday mornings, indifferent to the fact that my entire life had just been rewritten. I thought about calling my sister, Wendy, but I could not make my hands work the phone. I thought about the children coming home from school in a few hours, expecting the same mother, the same house, the same predictable rhythm of homework and dinner and bedtime stories, not knowing that the ground had shifted beneath all of us while they sat in their classrooms learning fractions and cursive handwriting. I thought about the 11 years, the countless small sacrifices, the nights I had stayed up with Grant when he was studying for his project management certification, the years I had worked overtime to help cover our mortgage during a lean stretch, the way I had held his hand at his father's funeral even though Harold had never once acknowledged me as his daughter-in-law. None of it, apparently, had counted for anything once $58 million entered the equation. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. In the days that followed, I was not a picture of graceful strength. I cried in the shower so the children would not hear me. I lay awake at night running through every conversation Grant and I had ever had, searching for the moment where the man I married had begun quietly becoming someone else, or whether that man had been there all along, hidden beneath a life too modest to reveal his true shape. I called my sister Wendy, finally, 3 days after Grant left, and she drove 2 hours from Cincinnati with a bag of groceries and a fierce, protective anger that made me feel, for the first time in that terrible week, that I was not entirely alone. Wendy sat with me at my kitchen table, the same table where Grant had once told me his father had died, and she said something I have carried with me ever since. She said that money does not change people, it only removes the friction that used to keep their worst impulses in check. She said that a poor man who is generous, patient, and loving is simply a wealthy man who has not yet had the opportunity to become cruel, or he is a genuinely good man whose character will hold regardless of circumstance, and the only way to know which kind of man you married is to watch what he does when the friction disappears. I did not want to believe that Grant had always had this cruelty in him, waiting. But I could not deny what I had seen in his eyes that Tuesday morning, standing in our kitchen, drinking coffee I had made with hands that had loved him faithfully for over a decade. The following weeks were a blur of lawyers and paperwork and the particular exhaustion that comes from trying to hold a family together while your own foundation is cracking beneath you. Grant moved into a rented penthouse downtown, the kind of place with a doorman and floor-to-ceiling windows, and I later learned that Diane Whitfield, the financial consultant who had so quickly reshaped his thinking, had moved in with him within a matter of weeks. I tried, for the sake of Josephine and Theodore, to keep our home stable, to keep their routines predictable even as everything around us was changing. Josephine, perceptive in the way that 9-year-olds sometimes are, asked me one evening why Daddy did not live with us anymore, and I told her, as gently as I could, that sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand, but that it was not because of anything she or her brother had done, and that I would always, always be there. Theodore, younger and simpler in his grief, mostly asked when Daddy was coming back to tuck him in, and each time I had to swallow the answer that felt truest and give him instead a gentler, kinder version of the truth. Grant's lawyer initially proposed a divorce settlement so thin it was almost insulting, an amount that would barely cover 6 months of our mortgage, despite the fact that we had built our marriage and raised our children on a shared, if modest, income for over a decade. I remember sitting across from my own lawyer, a soft-spoken but sharp woman named Colette Ferrante, who had built her practice representing spouses in difficult divorces, and feeling a strange mixture of humiliation and fury as she explained that Grant's team was arguing the inheritance was separate property, untouched by our marital partnership, as though the 11 years I had spent supporting him through his career, raising his children, managing our household finances, counted for nothing. Simply because the windfall had arrived after everything else. Colette told me not to worry, that Ohio law was more nuanced than Grant's lawyers were pretending, and that any appreciation or commingling of the inheritance during the marriage could still be relevant. But even she could not promise me an outcome, only that we would fight for what was fair. It was during this period, roughly 6 weeks after Grant left, that something unexpected began to happen. I had started, out of sheer necessity, picking up extra bookkeeping clients on the side, working evenings after the children were asleep, determined to prove to myself, if no one else, that I could stand on my own financial footing regardless of how the divorce settled. One of these clients was a small nonprofit called Hearth and Harbor, which ran a transitional housing program for families who had experienced sudden financial crises, often after a divorce, a medical emergency, or a job loss. The woman who ran it, a warm, weathered force of nature named Priscilla Adeyemi Vance, though her family had roots more in Yorkshire than anywhere else despite the compound name from her late husband's side, had built the organization from nothing over 15 years, and she took an immediate liking to me, not out of pity, but because she recognized in me a kind of quiet competence she valued. Priscilla and I would talk sometimes after I finished reconciling her organization's books, and I found myself telling her, in fragments over several weeks, about Grant, about the inheritance, about the strange vertigo of watching a marriage dissolve not from poverty but from sudden, staggering wealth. She listened without judgment, and one afternoon she said something that stayed with me long after I drove home. She said that she had seen this pattern many times in her years running the nonprofit, families who fell apart not despite good fortune but because of it, because sudden wealth has a way of exposing whether a person's love was ever truly about the other individual, or whether it was about what that person represented, comfort, stability, a hedge against loneliness, that could be discarded the moment something shinier appeared. She told me that the families who survived good fortune intact were the ones where both partners had already built their identity on something sturdier than circumstance, and that my grief, though real and valid, was not actually a referendum on my worth, but a revelation about the fragility of the foundation Grant had been standing on all along. I share this because I want you, wherever you are watching this from, to understand that the turning point in this story did not come from revenge, or from some dramatic confrontation, but from the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life on ground I trusted. If you have ever had to rebuild after someone you loved decided you were disposable, I want you to know that our channel exists because so many people in our community have lived through exactly this kind of quiet devastation, and I would be honored if you would subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear that it is possible to come out the other side whole. Around the 2-month mark after Grant left, something happened that neither of us could have predicted. Diane Whitfield, the financial consultant who had encouraged Grant to see our marriage as a constraint on his new life, was revealed, through an investigation initiated by the executor of Harold Calloway's estate, to have been quietly siphoning management fees and steering Harold's former investments toward accounts that benefited her personally, a pattern of financial manipulation that predated Harold's death and had, apparently, been the very reason Harold's business partner had grown suspicious of her in his final months. Grant, dazzled by Diane's confidence and charm, had given her sweeping authority over the newly inherited estate, appointing her as the primary manager of trusts and accounts before consulting any independent attorney of his own. When the executor's investigation came to light, it revealed that nearly $4 million had already been redirected into accounts Diane controlled, under the guise of management restructuring fees, that Grant, in his eagerness to appear sophisticated and unbothered by the sudden fortune, had never questioned. I did not learn about this from Grant. I learned about it from Wendy, who had heard it through a mutual acquaintance who worked at the same law firm handling the estate, and later confirmed through the local news, because a scandal involving millions of dollars and a sudden inheritance is the kind of story that finds its way into headlines even in a city the size of Columbus. I remember sitting in my kitchen, reading the article on my phone, feeling an emotion I had not expected, not satisfaction, not vindication, but a kind of aching sadness for the man I had once loved, who had been so wounded by his father's absence that when the money finally arrived, he had grasped for anyone who made him feel important, anyone who told him he deserved more than the life he had built with me, without pausing to ask whether that person actually had his best interests at heart. Grant called me 3 days after the news broke. It was the first time he had called me directly since the morning he walked out, aside from brief, clipped exchanges through lawyers about the children's schedules. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the cold confidence he had worn like a new suit that Tuesday morning in June. He asked if he could come by the house to see the kids, and something in his tone made me agree, though I insisted it be during the day, on a Saturday afternoon, with the understanding that this was about Josephine and Theodore, not about us. When Grant arrived that Saturday, I almost did not recognize him. He had lost weight in a way that did not look intentional, the hollows beneath his eyes deeper than I remembered, and he stood on our porch, in the same daylight that had witnessed the end of our marriage weeks earlier, looking suddenly, achingly human again. He played with Theodore in the backyard for over an hour, pushing him on the old wooden swing set we had built together 5 summers earlier, and Josephine, more guarded, sat on the porch steps watching them, occasionally allowing herself a small, cautious smile when her father made a joke that reminded her of the man he used to be before all of this happened. After the children had gone inside to watch a movie, Grant sat with me on the porch steps, the late afternoon sun slanting gold across the yard, and he told me everything. He told me that Diane had convinced him, slowly and expertly, that his previous life had been a kind of prison, that the modesty I represented was actually a limitation he had outgrown, that a man worth $58 million needed a partner who understood ambition, sophistication, legacy. He told me that in the weeks after he left, as Diane took control of more and more of the estate, he had started to feel a creeping unease he could not name, a sense that he was being managed rather than loved, but that his pride would not let him admit it, especially not to me, the woman he had so cruelly discarded. When the investigation revealed the extent of Diane's manipulation, he said, something in him finally broke open, and for the first time since his father's death, he understood that the emptiness he had been trying to fill with money and validation had never actually been about wealth at all. It had been about a boy who was abandoned at 14, who had spent his whole life believing that if he ever became powerful enough, important enough, he would never again feel small the way his father's absence had made him feel. I listened to all of this without saying much, because I had learned by then that some moments call for silence rather than forgiveness offered too quickly. I told him that I appreciated his honesty, but that honesty 6 weeks too late did not undo the words he had said to me in our kitchen, the cruelty in his eyes, the ease with which he had told me to pack a bag as though 11 years of partnership could be folded up and discarded like an outdated contract. Grant nodded, his eyes wet in a way I had rarely seen in all our years together, and said that he was not there to ask me to take him back, that he knew he had not earned that, but that he wanted, more than anything, to become someone his children could be proud of, and that meant first becoming someone he could look at in the mirror without flinching. If you have ever had to decide whether someone deserved a second chance after they hurt you deeply, I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because these are the conversations that make our community feel like a real gathering of people who understand that forgiveness is rarely simple, and that it is a choice we sometimes have to make more than once. The months that followed were not a fairy tale reconciliation, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories that skip too quickly to happy endings do a disservice to anyone who is actually living through something painful right now. Grant fired every advisor Diane had installed and hired an independent, court-appointed fiduciary to help him recover as much of the estate as possible, a slow and grinding legal process that would take the better part of a year. He entered therapy, something he had always dismissed in our marriage as unnecessary for a man who could just work through things, and began, for the first time in his adult life, actually confronting the wound his father's abandonment had left in him rather than letting it quietly steer his decisions from the shadows. He did not ask to move back into our house. He rented a small apartment across town, modest by his new financial standards, and he began showing up, reliably, every week, for the children, coaching Theodore's soccer team on Saturday mornings, driving Josephine to her piano lessons on Wednesday afternoons, small consistent acts that slowly, over months, began to rebuild something between him and our children that his sudden departure had nearly shattered. As for me, the divorce settlement was eventually finalized, and Colette Ferrante's persistence paid off. The court recognized that although the inheritance itself was Grant's separate property, the 11 years of shared partnership, my contributions to our household, my career sacrifices, and the marital funds that had been commingled with early estate management decisions entitled me to a fair and substantial settlement, enough to pay off our old mortgage entirely, enough to give Josephine and Theodore the stability of remaining in the only home they had ever known, enough to allow me to leave my bookkeeping job at the veterinary clinics and, at Priscilla's encouragement, take a full-time position managing finances for Hearth and Harbor, the non-profit that had, without my fully realizing it at the time, become a kind of lifeline during the hardest months of my life. I want to tell you about a particular afternoon that I think captures the true turning point of this story better than any single confrontation or revelation could. It was nearly a year after that terrible Tuesday morning in our kitchen. Josephine had a piano recital at her elementary school, a small, unglamorous affair in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and construction paper, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, parents fanning themselves with paper programs in the early June heat. Grant arrived early, sat beside me without being asked, and when Josephine walked out onto the small stage, visibly nervous, scanning the crowd until her eyes found both of us sitting together, something in her shoulders visibly relaxed, and she played her piece, a simple but earnest rendition of a folk melody, with a kind of concentration that made my chest ache with pride. Afterward, in the parking lot, Grant thanked me, not for anything specific, but in a broader sense, for holding our family together during the months when he had been too lost in his own grief and greed to see what he was destroying. He told me that watching Josephine on that small stage, watching Theodore cheer louder than anyone else in the gymnasium, he understood with total clarity that the $58 million his father left him meant nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the ordinary, unglamorous, deeply loving family we had built together over 11 years. The family he had so carelessly tried to discard the moment he believed money could buy him something better. He told me he did not expect me to ever fully trust him again in the way I once had, and that he understood if that door had closed permanently, but that he wanted me to know, regardless of what happened between us romantically, that he saw now, with the clarity that only real loss can provide, exactly what I had given him, and exactly what kind of man he had almost let himself become. I will not pretend that hearing those words erased the pain of that Tuesday morning, the humiliation of being told I was no longer needed after 11 years of partnership, the terror of watching my children's world crack open because their father mistook cruelty for liberation. Healing does not work that neatly. But standing in that parking lot, watching Josephine and Theodore run ahead of us toward the car, laughing about something only siblings can find funny, I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a knot I had been carrying for a year finally beginning, just barely, to soften. We did not immediately reconcile, and I think that mattered, because rushing back together would have repeated the same pattern of impulsive decisions that had caused so much damage in the first place. Instead, over the following year, Grant and I built something new and slower, coffee together on Sunday mornings when he dropped off the kids, occasional dinners as a family, careful and deliberate, built on actions rather than promises. He used a portion of the recovered estate, once the legal battle with Diane Whitfield concluded with her facing serious fraud charges and Grant recovering nearly $3 million of the misappropriated funds, to establish a scholarship fund in his father's name, not out of any particular love for Harold, but as a way of transforming a legacy of absence and greed into something that might help other fatherless children the way no one had ever helped him. He donated, quietly and without seeking recognition, a substantial sum to Hearth and Harbor, ensuring that Priscilla's transitional housing program could expand to serve twice as many families in crisis, families who, like me, had found themselves suddenly and unexpectedly alone. It was Priscilla, in fact, who eventually said something to me that I think captures the deepest truth of this entire story. She told me that the measure of a person's character is never revealed by how they behave when they have nothing to lose, but by how they behave when they suddenly have everything to gain. Grant had failed that test spectacularly in the beginning, and the failure had cost him almost everything that mattered. But she also told me that the rarer and more remarkable thing, the thing worth genuinely honoring, is when a person who fails that test is given the grace of time and finds their way back to who they actually are underneath the fear and the wounds and the desperate hunger for validation. She said that forgiveness is not about pretending the harm did not happen, but about refusing to let that harm be the final word on a person's story, if they are willing to do the excruciating work of proving, through consistent action rather than words, that they deserve a chance to write a different ending. Nearly 2 years after that Tuesday morning in our kitchen, Grant and I remarried in a small ceremony, not extravagant despite the fortune now sitting quietly and responsibly in trust accounts overseen by an independent fiduciary board Grant himself had insisted on establishing, but simple and heartfelt, held in the same backyard where we had married 11 years, now 13 years, earlier, string lights threaded through the same maple trees, now taller and fuller with age. Josephine, 12 now, served as our flower girl, though she insisted she was far too old for the title and did it anyway with a grin. Theodore, 8, stood beside his father, wearing a small suit that made him look absurdly proud of himself. Wendy stood beside me, tears streaming unapologetically down her face, and Priscilla sat in the front row, having become something between a mentor and a second mother to me over those 2 transformative years. I will not tell you that our marriage since then has been without difficulty, because no honest story about love and forgiveness would claim that. There are still days when the memory of that Tuesday morning rises up in me unexpectedly, when I see Grant's face and for a fraction of a second remember the coldness in his eyes as he told me he did not need me anymore. But I have learned, through the slow and deliberate work of the past 2 years, that a single terrible moment does not have to define an entire life, that people are capable of profound and genuine change when they are willing to face the ugliest parts of themselves honestly, and that the family we choose to rebuild, piece by careful piece, can sometimes become stronger and more honest than the one that existed before it was tested by fire. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something, because I believe the comments section of a video like this is where the real healing often happens. Have you ever had to decide whether to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, and if so, what helped you make that decision? I would be so grateful if you would share your own experience below, because so many people in our community are carrying similar wounds, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other is simply the knowledge that we are not alone in this particular kind of pain. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about what stayed with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder today that second chances are possible even after devastating betrayal, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about kindness, forgiveness, and the quiet, stubborn hope that carries ordinary families through their darkest seasons. These days, when I stand in my kitchen in the mornings, pouring 2 cups of coffee, cream and barely any sugar in mine, black in his, I sometimes think about how close we came to losing everything, not because we were poor, but because we were suddenly, overwhelmingly rich, and how strange it is that the true test of our love was never the years of tight budgets and second-hand furniture and worrying about the mortgage, but the single, blinding moment when money offered Grant an escape from the ordinary, imperfect, deeply human life we had built together. He chose wrong, at first, and it nearly destroyed us. But he found his way back, through hard work and honest reckoning and a willingness to sit with the shame of who he had briefly allowed himself to become, and I have come to believe that this, more than the $58 million, more than the scandal, more than the year of pain, is the actual inheritance our children will carry forward, the knowledge that even when the people we love fail us in devastating ways, there is still, sometimes, a path back to each other, paved not with money, but with humility, patience, and the quiet, daily choice to keep showing up, morning after ordinary morning, until trust is rebuilt one small act at a time. And if you have made it this far with us, watching our family's story unfold, I hope you carry a piece of that hope with you today, wherever you are, whatever you are facing, because our channel and our community exist precisely for moments like this one, to remind each other that no matter how dark a chapter becomes, kindness and forgiveness still have the power to write a better ending than we ever thought possible.